Ah, look who just became a concern. Not because you raised your voice, not because you broke rules or demanded attention, but because something about you no longer fits the shape they expected. You can feel it, can't you? That subtle pause when you enter a space. That hesitation in conversations that used to flow easily. The way people search your face a second longer than necessary, as if checking whether the version of you they remember is still there. It isn't, and that's the part that unsettles them. For a long time, you were readable, predictable enough to be categorized. Your reactions made sense. Your patterns could be anticipated. Your pain followed familiar lines. Then the pressure came, not all at once, but layered. Loss stacked on loss, betrayal disguised as care. Moments where you were quietly abandoned and told it was for your own good. They expected collapse. They expected noise, explanations. A public unraveling they could point to and say, there it is. But you didn't give them that. Instead, you went quiet. Not empty, not numb. Quiet in the way a mind becomes quiet when it's listening instead of begging. You stopped narrating your suffering, stopped translating yourself for people who only wanted fragments, stopped feeding the structures that survived on your reactions. That's when you started to change. Pain didn't erase you, it reorganized you. You began to notice how often systems rely on participation, how expectations only hold power when you agree to play along, how guilt needs an audience, how shame needs your consent. And slowly, without any announcement, you withdrew that consent. They tried to read you using old frameworks, old labels, old versions of your story, but the record didn't line up anymore. Your past didn't explain your present. Your reactions didn't match the stimuli. Your silence didn't signal weakness. It signaled processing. That's when confusion set in, because confusion is what happens when control stops working. You weren't rebelling. You weren't resisting. You weren't fighting anything at all. You were outgrowing it. You learned the difference between attention and understanding, between being seen and being known, between performance and presence. You realized how much energy it takes to stay small enough to be comfortable for others. So you stopped. And the moment you stopped shrinking, you became difficult to define. People noticed the absence first, the absence of chasing reassurance, the absence of emotional urgency. You no longer rushed to fix misunderstandings that weren't yours to fix. You no longer volunteered pieces of yourself as proof of good intentions. You waited. And waiting, when done with awareness, feels threatening to those who depend on immediacy. They tried subtle tests, old dynamics, familiar pressures, the same emotional levers that used to move you without effort. But you didn't respond the same way. You didn't flare up, you didn't fold, you didn't disappear, you observed. You let patterns reveal themselves without interruption. That's when they realized something important had shifted. Not outside of you, inside. Your priorities changed. You stopped valuing approval over alignment, stopped trading peace for proximity, stopped confusing intensity with depth. You learned that clarity doesn't shout. It stands, and standing, still rooted, is unnerving in a world built on constant motion. They can't place you anymore. You don't fit the narrative of someone who broke and stayed broken. You don't fit the redemption arc that requires confession and applause. You don't fit the comeback story that needs validation to feel real. You rebuilt privately, without witnesses, without permission, without an audience to cheer when things got hard. And now, when people look at you, they feel the difference even if they can't articulate it. Your presence doesn't seek entry. It doesn't ask for space. It occupies it naturally. That's why the word concern starts to surface, not as fear, but as recalibration, because systems built on predictability struggle with those who act from awareness instead of impulse. You don't broadcast your inner world anymore. You don't leak strategy through emotion. You don't hand over access without intention. You learned the hard way that not everyone deserves the same level of transparency. That lesson alone rewired everything. You became selective, not closed, not guarded out of fear. Disciplined, you stopped reacting to noise, stopped explaining your growth to people committed to misunderstanding it, stopped dragging old versions of yourself into new spaces just to be recognized. And in doing so, you slipped outside the usual classifications. They expected anger. You offered composure. They expected rebellion. You chose autonomy. They expected collapse. You demonstrated coherence. That coherence is what disrupts rigid thinking, because it doesn't need to be defended. It doesn't need to be justified. It simply exists, steady and unmoved. You don't threaten structures by attacking them. You unsettle them by no longer depending on them. That's the difference, and that difference is quiet enough to be missed by anyone not paying attention. But those who rely on control always pay attention. They sense when someone stops being available to manipulation, when shame no longer sticks, when guilt no longer redirects behavior. You're not immune to pain. You're immune to coercion, because you faced your worst moments without outsourcing your strength. You met yourself where there was nothing left to prove, and once you do that, the old tools stop working. People project now. They call you distant because you don't overshare. They call you intense because you don't dilute your truth. They call you different because they can't map you anymore. They're not wrong. You are different, not superior, not dangerous, independent, and independence disrupts expectations, especially in environments that reward compliance disguised as harmony. You're not trying to wake anyone up. You're not trying to pull others along. You're simply living from a place that no longer negotiates its own existence. That's what turned you into a concern. Not because you're plotting, not because you're resisting, but because you're no longer predictable in the ways that made you manageable. And once someone realizes that, the questions begin, quiet ones, uncomfortable ones, questions about limits, about control, about whether the frameworks they rely on are as solid as they believed. You didn't set out to ask those questions. You answered them for yourself first. And now, without saying a word, you carry the evidence. You don't announce what you survived. You don't list the things that almost broke you. You don't wear your transformation like a warning sign. You let it speak through restraint, through boundaries that don't need explanation, through choices that don't require consensus. You're not finished, not even close, but you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. The line where pain stops being something that happens to you and becomes something that taught you how to see. And once you see this clearly, you don't go back, you continue. You didn't set out to become this. That's the part most people miss. You weren't trying to be difficult. You weren't trying to stand apart. You weren't trying to prove anything. You were trying to survive. And survival, when done honestly, has a way of stripping away everything unnecessary. It asks questions that comfort never asks. Stay or leave, tell the truth or keep the peace, shrink or hold your ground. You answered those questions in private, where no one was watching, and those answers rewrote you. That's why the attention feels different. Now, it's not admiration, it's not hostility either. It's recalibration. People sense when someone has stopped running on the same internal software. They may not have language for it, but they feel it in the way conversations shift around you, in the way old dynamics no longer land, in the way assumptions bounce off instead of sticking, You don't react the way you used to. And that's the first sign. The second sign is restraint. You don't rush to correct every misunderstanding. You don't chase closure from people who benefited from confusion. You don't exhaust yourself trying to be seen accurately by those who never looked closely in the first place. That restraint reads as confidence to some, as distance to others, but it's neither. It's efficiency. You learned how expensive emotional leakage is, how quickly it drains clarity, how often it feeds systems that were never designed to return anything of value. So you tightened the flow, not shutting down, not numbing out, just choosing where your energy goes. That choice alone changes how people perceive you, because so much of social order relies on predictability, on knowing which buttons to press, on expecting certain reactions on cue. You no longer provide those cues. And when cues disappear, people start asking why. They review the past versions of you, the moments where you were more accessible, more pliable, more willing to explain yourself into exhaustion. They try to reconcile those versions with the person standing in front of them now. The math doesn't work. You still care, but you care with boundaries. You still feel, but you don't hemorrhage emotion. You still engage, but you don't chase alignment with those committed to misunderstanding you. That combination is rare, and rarity is often mistaken for threat. Not because it's harmful, but because it exposes dependency. Some people depended on your predictability, on your self-doubt, on your willingness to bend first. When that disappears, they have to confront something uncomfortable. Their influence wasn't as natural as they believed. Their authority wasn't as solid as it felt. Their role in your life wasn't guaranteed. So the language around you shifts. You hear words like changed, hard to read, intense, different. Those words aren't diagnoses, they're reactions. They're attempts to stabilize an internal picture that no longer matches reality. You're not hiding anything. You're simply no longer overexposing yourself. And overexposure, you learned, was never honesty. It was habit. A habit formed in environments where being open was safer than being precise. You outgrew that. Pain taught you discernment. It showed you how often vulnerability gets confused with accessibility. How often empathy becomes an invitation to overstep. How often being understood costs more than it gives. So you adjusted. You started letting silence do some of the work. Silence doesn't argue, it doesn't persuade, it doesn't chase, it waits. And waiting is powerful when it's grounded in clarity. You let people reveal themselves without interruption. You let patterns complete instead of cutting them short. You stopped rescuing dynamics that were already showing you their limits. That's when things really shifted, because the absence of your usual responses forced others to fill the space themselves, and what they filled it with told you everything you needed to know. Some stepped back, some leaned in, some grew uncomfortable, some tried to provoke reactions just to feel the old sense of control return. You watched, not with judgment. With information, that's the part no one prepared you for. Growth doesn't make life louder. It makes it quieter, cleaner. You stop spending energy on arguments that go nowhere. You stop rehearsing conversations that never needed to happen. You stop explaining choices to people who aren't responsible for the outcomes. Your world gets smaller, but more precise, and precision is unsettling to environments built on noise. They can't accuse you of anything concrete. You haven't done anything wrong. You didn't break rules. You didn't attack structures. You didn't reject connection. You simply stopped outsourcing your sense of self. That's what turned you into a concern. Not because you're unpredictable, but because you're internally consistent. Your decisions align with your values. Your actions match your words. Your boundaries hold even when tested. Consistency like that doesn't bend easily. And systems that rely on flexibility, on people adjusting themselves endlessly to fit expectations, don't know what to do with someone who no longer negotiates their core. You don't need to announce this shift. In fact, announcing it would dilute it. Your presence carries it quietly. People feel it when you don't overreact, when you don't rush, when you don't scramble to be included. They feel it when you walk away without drama, when you stay without clinging, when you choose yourself without making it a performance. That's the kind of autonomy that can't be easily dismissed, because it doesn't ask permission. It doesn't need agreement. It doesn't need to be understood to move forward. You're not trying to dismantle anything. You're demonstrating something, that it's possible to exist without constant validation, that it's possible to grow without announcing progress, that it's possible to survive deep damage without turning bitter or loud. And demonstration is always more disruptive than declaration. People can argue with opinions. They can debate ideas. But lived clarity is harder to contest. It sits there, undeniable. You notice it in the way conversations end sooner. Now in the way people choose their words more carefully around you. In the way certain dynamics quietly retire themselves. Not because you demanded it, because they no longer function. You don't chase people who pull away. You don't cling to roles that no longer fit. You don't justify evolution to those invested in your old shape. That's not arrogance. That's respect for yourself and for reality. And here's the part that matters most. You didn't become this by avoiding pain. You became this by staying present inside it. You didn't bypass discomfort. You studied it. You learned how fear tries to rush decisions, how guilt disguises itself as responsibility, how shame pretends to be humility. Once you see those patterns, they lose their grip. They still appear, but they don't command. You can feel them without obeying them. That's freedom. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that shows up in choices no one applauds. You don't need to convince anyone of who you are. Time does that work for you now. Consistency reveals more than explanation ever could. You continue to move, continue to build, continue to choose alignment over approval. And as you do, the attention around you will keep adjusting. Some will misunderstand, some will project, some will quietly take notes. That's fine. You're not here to manage reactions, you're here to live accurately. And accuracy, once established, doesn't retreat. It deepens. You haven't reached an endpoint. You've reached a threshold. What comes next doesn't require force. It requires continuation. The same way you've been doing it all along, one clear choice at a time.